Welcome to Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. These are real events retold as haunting bedtime tales. Let's get into it.
The Colonial Parkway had always been a place where history and nature coexisted. Couples would drive late into the evening, windows down, music low, sharing whispered conversations about college, work, or dreams of the future. It was a place where young love could feel safe, far from the city and its dangers. But between 1986 and 1989, that sense of safety was shattered in a way that left the entire region holding its breath. It began with small disappearances, seemingly ordinary at first. A car left parked along a quiet turn. A college student missing after a weekend drive. The initial assumption was always simple: perhaps the couple had a fight, maybe they left for another town, maybe it was just a late night that ran too long. But then the pattern emerged. Cars abandoned with no explanation. Belongings untouched. And in every case, when authorities finally found the victims, the horror was undeniable. They had been shot, execution style, at close range, sometimes still slumped in their seats or lying nearby, as if the killer had approached silently and struck without warning. What unsettled investigators most wasn't just the violence, but the precision. There was no sign of struggle. No frantic attempts to flee. It was as if the victims had been frozen in the moment, and the killer had moved through the scene with complete control. Patrols were increased, officers staked out parking areas and pull-offs, and yet the attacks continued. It became clear that whoever was responsible understood the parkway in a way outsiders could not, knew the curves, the hidden spots, the places where no one else would be. Eyewitness accounts were scarce, but each one added another piece to a puzzle that seemed impossible to complete. A couple reported seeing headlights in the distance, parked unnaturally in the woods. A jogger remembered hearing faint footsteps just off the road. There were rumors of cars following other cars late at night, of shadowy figures slipping between vanishing before anyone could confirm their presence. Yet nothing concrete ever emerged, just hints of something lurking, patient, watching. The pattern of the attack suggested more than opportunistic violence. These were not crimes of passion or random encounters. The killer or killers selected their victims carefully, targeting young couples who were alone, isolated, and vulnerable. There was a methodical quality to it, a chilling calculation that spoke to experience and planning. Detectives began to suspect someone intimately familiar with the area, someone who could strike and disappear without leaving a trace. For the families and friends of the victims, the terror went beyond grief. It was the knowledge that someone was out there, waiting, patient, and perhaps still watching. College students who had once considered the parkway a shortcut home now avoided it entirely. Lovers drove with heightened awareness, scanning every curve for headlights, every shadow for movement. A place that had once been serene had transformed into something alive with fear, every darkened pull-off a reminder of the violence that had already occurred. The investigators who worked the case described it as some of the most frustrating and haunting work of their careers. They could see the logic behind the attacks, the control, the precision, but the killer remained elusive. Every lead ended in a dead end, every tip brought only speculation. The pattern was clear, but the perpetrator was not. And as the bodies accumulated and the years passed, the Colonial Parkway earned a reputation that it would never shake, a road where beauty and terror collided, where young love could be snuffed out in an instant, and where the shadows themselves seemed to hide someone patient, calculated, and invisible. Even decades later, the parkway carries that weight. Locals drive it with caution, whispering about the murders in quiet tones, almost afraid to speak too loudly. Tourists sometimes pause to take in the scenery, oblivious to the dark history beneath the trees and curves. And somewhere in the back of the mind of anyone who knows the story is the lingering question: who was watching, waiting, and how many more times could it have happened without anyone knowing? Investigators began mapping the attacks, trying to find a rhythm, a signature, something that would explain the killer's behavior. And the more they looked, the more unnerving the pattern became. Almost every victim was a young couple, late teens or early 20s. They weren't strangers to the area, they were locals or college students, often on dates, enjoying what they thought was a carefree night drive. Sometimes they were just leaving a party, sometimes returning from the beach. There was no apparent reason for the killer to choose them, no obvious connection between the pairs, no history that tied them together outside of the parkway. The attacks always happened in the same types of locations, secluded, isolated, and perfectly suited for ambush. Hidden curves, long stretches of road with no streetlights, pull-offs that felt safe but were anything but. Some spots were visible from the road but obscured from any passing car, places where someone could watch for hours without being seen. Others were tucked into wooded areas where the sounds of struggle could be masked by the forest. The killer or killers had a terrifying understanding of human behavior. They knew where people would feel safe and how to exploit that trust. Cars became grim evidence of the pattern itself. Some were found with keys still in the ignition, as if the driver had planned to return but never could. Others were partially parked, tires angled oddly, doors unlocked, windows down. Every detail suggested that the victims had no warning, no chance to react, no reason to suspect danger. It wasn't that the killer struck randomly, it was that he knew how to make the victims feel secure until it was too late. The method was equally calculated. Most victims were shot at close range, some multiple times, with no indication of a struggle. It was as if the killer had practiced, rehearsed, or studied the act itself. In some cases, the bodies were positioned in ways that suggested an eerie familiarity with how humans respond to fear. The absence of defensive wounds in several victims only added to the unease. This wasn't just murder, it was control, and control executed with terrifying confidence. For investigators, the lack of physical evidence was maddening. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no traceable DNA, or at least none that could be identified with the technology of the time. Car doors unlocked, belongings left behind, no signs of robbery. The scene suggested planning at a level most law enforcement hadn't seen in a local case before. Someone knew how to strike without leaving a trail, how to move through these wooded corridors without detection. The killer, or killers, were not amateurs. They were methodical, patient, and likely familiar with law enforcement patterns, knowing what would and wouldn't attract attention. This level of planning suggested more than simple malice, it suggested someone with patience and the ability to manipulate not just the victims but the environment itself. Officers studied the topography of the parkway, looking for patterns in elevation, line of sight, and distances from houses or roads. Some of the pull-offs were near shallow riverbanks, others near the edge of the forest where headlights couldn't penetrate. The killers seemed to know precisely how far they could operate without being caught, and this level of control unsettled investigators more than the murders themselves. The psychological implications were even more disturbing. By targeting couples, people in vulnerable, trusting situations, the killer was preying on intimacy itself. A car ride at night is supposed to be private, a time for connection and conversation. Yet these same moments became death traps. Experts speculated that the killer derived satisfaction from the betrayal of that trust, from taking what was ordinary and safe and turning it into something horrifying. The attacks weren't just about killing, they were about control, dominance, and fear. Investigators also noticed a subtle escalation. Early victims were found relatively close to populated areas, later victims were discovered in increasingly remote spots. It was almost as if the killer's confidence grew over time, their comfort with the parkway and with the act of murder deepening. They seemed to be testing the limits of law enforcement, seeing how far they could operate without detection. And with every attack, the sense of invincibility grew. The community, meanwhile, began to feel the pressure. Couples who once drove the parkway freely at night stopped doing so. Parents forbade late-night drives. Students at nearby colleges whispered about strange cars parked in the woods or figures glimpsed among the trees. Every curve, every pull-off, became a potential threat. The parkway, which had once been a symbol of scenic beauty and historical charm, had transformed into a place of paranoia. People spoke of a watcher in the woods, a ghostly presence that could strike anywhere along the 23-mile stretch. Law enforcement struggled to match the killer's planning. Patrols were increased, but the attacks continued. Investigators conducted stakeouts, sometimes for hours at a time, but the parkway's length and the killer's patience made it nearly impossible to predict the next move. Descriptions from the rare witnesses were often vague: headlights in the distance, a car parked strangely, a silhouette in the trees. Nothing conclusive. Each lead dissolved into frustration, leaving officers feeling powerless. The killer's confidence was mirrored in the audacity of the crimes themselves. There was no hurried escape, no reckless movement. The attacks were executed with precision and timing. It was as if the killer had rehearsed the entire scenario, identifying a couple, following them until the right moment, striking, and then vanishing without a trace. To the victims, there was no warning. To the investigators, there was no pattern that could be broken without luck or a new piece of evidence. And yet, there was a haunting consistency. The selection of victims, the locations, the method, all pointed to someone intimately familiar with the road, the area, and human behavior. It was clear that this wasn't a transient criminal, this was someone rooted in the region, someone who knew the parkway as well as anyone who had lived nearby for years. By the end of the 1980s, law enforcement was exhausted but determined. They had identified the pattern, understood the modus operandi, and recognized the psychological profile: a patient, calculating, and confident individual, possibly with military or law enforcement experience, who knew how to exploit both terrain and human trust. But even with all this knowledge, the killer remained unseen, untouchable, and unknown. The Colonial Parkway had become a hunting ground, and the killer had become a phantom, a presence felt but never caught, lurking in the shadows of history. Each discovery of an abandoned car, each report of a couple gone missing, reinforced the terrifying realization: the murderer could strike again at any moment, anywhere along those winding roads. And with no evidence to tie a suspect to the crimes, the fear of the unknown loomed larger than the crimes themselves. Even today, the parkway carries that shadow. Visitors see only trees, curves, and rivers, but the memory of the attacks, the precision, the secrecy, the absolute control the killer wielded, lingers. It's a chilling reminder that some predators aren't strangers in the night. Sometimes, they're patient, methodical, and disturbingly familiar, waiting in plain sight along a road that looks safe but has never truly been safe at all. Despite the urgency and public attention, the investigation into the Colonial Parkway murders quickly proved more complex than anyone anticipated. Hundreds of tips poured in from frightened locals, anonymous callers, and concerned relatives, each one promising a lead but delivering little more than a shadow. Some claimed to have seen suspicious vehicles along the parkway late at night, while others remembered a figure lurking near a wooded pull-off. Every tip required follow-up, and yet none led to a breakthrough. The sheer volume became overwhelming, and many leads went cold within days. At first, law enforcement suspected multiple offenders. The murders appeared to vary slightly in execution: some victims shot inside the car, others outside, some bodies left in plain view, others partially hidden. This variation suggested different hands or personalities. Detectives speculated that perhaps a pair of killers had operated in tandem, one providing control, the other carrying out the act. But as the case unfolded, the evidence began to point toward a single, highly methodical individual. The precision of the attacks, the careful selection of locations, the timing, the clean execution, suggested someone who had studied the victims, the road, and the terrain with meticulous attention. Thousands of interviews were conducted. Investigators knocked on doors in Williamsburg, Yorktown, Jamestown, and beyond, questioning anyone who might have seen a car parked late at night or noticed a stranger in the woods. People remembered minor details: an unfamiliar face at a party, a strange man at a gas station, headlights flickering in the trees, but every account was anecdotal. And nothing could be substantiated. Those who were considered suspects often had alibis or no connection strong enough to hold in court. Some were questioned repeatedly, their frustration growing as investigators pushed for something concrete that never materialized. Records of local criminals were meticulously examined. Investigators scoured arrest logs, parole records, and civil complaints, searching for anyone with a history of violence, sexual offenses, or suspicious behavior along the parkway. Patterns were analyzed, but nothing aligned with the timing or methods of the murders. There were people who seemed to fit parts of the profile, men who were violent, erratic, or known to lurk near isolated areas, but each one failed to provide a complete picture. It was as if the killer had erased themselves from any official record, leaving behind only the haunting echoes of their crimes. Forensic science, or rather the lack of it, played a critical role in the slow progress. In the late 1980s, DNA analysis was in its infancy. Shell casings from the murder weapon were preserved, tire tracks were photographed, and fibers were collected, but the technology of the day couldn't extract the clues that decades later would become crucial. Investigators could compare weapon types and calibers, measure bullet trajectories, and analyze the position of victims' bodies, but without DNA or definitive physical links, every lead remained speculative. The absence of concrete forensic evidence left the case in a frustrating limbo. Even the crime scenes themselves offered little to guide investigators. Cars were abandoned in ways that suggested the victims intended to return, yet no struggle had occurred. There were no personal items missing, no apparent motive of robbery or random aggression. Each scene had a disturbing quality of control, as if the killer had rehearsed the attacks and carefully orchestrated them. Detectives noted subtle consistencies: the locations were remote but accessible, the shootings executed quietly, and the killer's approach left almost no trace beyond the aftermath. These details were enough to unsettle anyone studying the case, but not enough to catch the perpetrator. By the early 1990s, frustration had mounted. The trail had gone cold. Families were left without closure, grappling with the incomprehensible loss of loved ones. For the young men and women whose lives were cut short, there would be no funeral that answered the most pressing question: why? And for the communities surrounding the Colonial Parkway, the murders were no longer just a series of tragic events, they became a collective shadow. Residents avoided night drives, parents warned their children to stay on well-lit roads, and whispers of a stalker in the woods grew into local legend. Media coverage added another layer of complexity. Newspapers ran stories detailing the sequence of murders, interviews with grieving families, and theories about suspects. Television news crews arrived to film the scenic road, contrasting its idyllic beauty with the violence that had marred it. The coverage kept public attention alive, but it also fueled fear. Every curve, every pull-off, every stretch of forest became a potential threat. The parkway, once known for history and romance, became synonymous with terror. The investigative challenges were compounded by the passage of time. Witnesses' memories faded, records were misplaced, and key details were lost in the shuffle of case files. Detectives who had worked the murders began retiring, leaving a knowledge gap that slowed the continuity of the investigation. Coordination between local, state, and federal agencies was imperfect, sometimes leaving questions unanswered for months. And every year that passed without an arrest deepened the sense that the killer had become untouchable. Criminal profilers brought in to assist painted a chilling picture. The killer was likely someone who understood human behavior, who could exploit intimacy and trust to his advantage. The selection of young couples suggested someone targeting vulnerability, the kind of predatory pattern rarely seen in random acts of violence. Profiles speculated that the killer might have experience in law enforcement, the military, or another structured environment that required patience and attention to detail. But these were educated guesses, not evidence. And with each unanswered question, the sense of dread surrounding the parkway only grew. Community members began to speculate. Some believed the killer was still local, possibly someone who drove the same roads each night under the guise of normal life. Others suspected an outsider, someone who had studied the area extensively and disappeared before law enforcement could close in. Rumors circulated of suspicious cars parked along the parkway late at night, of headlights flickering in the trees, of shadowy figures glimpsed from passing vehicles. But every report was anecdotal, impossible to verify, and left a lingering tension that the community could not shake. The murders, in their methodical cruelty, left investigators frustrated not just by the lack of evidence but by the psychological torment of understanding the killer's mindset. The precision, the control, the patience, it was all deliberate. The killer's ability to strike repeatedly without being detected suggested someone comfortable with risk, confident in their ability to evade consequences. It was as if each attack was not just about murder but a demonstration of mastery, a way to assert dominance over both victims and the law itself. By the mid-1990s, the Colonial Parkway Murders had become one of Virginia's most infamous unsolved cases. The trail of fear and loss stretched beyond the victims' families to the entire region. Couples drove cautiously, teenagers dared each other to approach the parkway at night, and historians and true crime writers began chronicling the events as a dark chapter in Virginia's history. Law enforcement kept the case open, re-examining evidence when new technology emerged, but the killer remained beyond reach. Even decades later, the story of the Colonial Parkway Murders is remembered not just for the brutality but for the frustration it imposed on investigators and the fear it instilled in an entire region. The killer's identity remains a ghost, a shadow that moved silently through the trees, leaving a legacy of terror and unanswered questions. For the families, the community, and anyone who has studied the case, the haunting truth is clear: some predators are patient, methodical, and terrifyingly clever, and even with every resource available, they may never be caught. The Colonial Parkway, once a symbol of scenic beauty and romance, will forever carry the memory of those lost. Every quiet curve, every hidden pull-off, every stretch of forested road is a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. And for those who lived through the 1980s in southeastern Virginia, the fear that something unseen was always watching has never fully faded. As the Colonial Parkway investigation dragged on, the spotlight inevitably turned toward potential suspects. Law enforcement considered everyone, from local troublemakers to transient outsiders, but the more they looked, the more unsettling the picture became. The killer, whoever they were, didn't seem random. The selection of victims, young couples alone at night, suggested someone who understood human behavior intimately. They were picking targets who were vulnerable, trusting, and isolated. That level of observation implied patience, intelligence, and a degree of cold calculation that investigators could not ignore. Some of the first suspects were local men with criminal histories, people known to police for violence, theft, or assault offenses. One man had been arrested for assault in the 1970s, a history that included confrontations with young couples. Another had a reputation for stalking, lingering near bars and college campuses late at night. But despite being persons of interest, none of these men could be conclusively tied to the crimes. Alibis were established, witnesses were inconsistent, and crucial evidence, fingerprints, DNA, was either missing or unusable. Every lead that seemed promising ended in frustration. Investigators also considered the possibility of someone transient, a drifter familiar with the roads and the forested areas surrounding the parkway. Several reports came in of suspicious vehicles at odd hours, often with headlights off or parked strangely along wooded stretches. One couple claimed to have been followed on the parkway late at night by a dark sedan, only to lose sight of it after a turn. Another witness remembered a man who appeared to be watching from the trees as they passed. While none of these accounts led to a suspect, they added to the chilling narrative: someone was observing, learning, and exploiting patterns. Criminal profilers brought in to consult on the case painted a disturbing psychological picture. They suggested the killer could be someone with experience in law enforcement, the military, or a profession that demanded patience and meticulous attention to detail. Someone capable of remaining calm under stress, someone able to plan several steps ahead. The precision of the murders, the careful selection of pull-offs, the methodical execution, reinforced this profile. The killer was confident, deliberate, and entirely comfortable in their environment. As years passed, theories multiplied. Some speculated that the killer could have been a local man who drove the same roads nightly, blending into normal life while targeting unsuspecting couples. Others suggested a stranger with transient patterns, someone moving through the area in cycles, striking and then disappearing before law enforcement could respond. Some investigators even proposed a copycat scenario, though the consistent method and pattern of execution across years suggested a single offender. Despite the speculation, frustration mounted. No arrest was ever made, and no charges were brought. Evidence that might have pointed to a suspect, the tire tracks, the shell casings, even eyewitness accounts, had either degraded over time or proved inconclusive. The case became a haunting reminder of the limits of investigative tools in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and of the patience and cunning of a killer who seemed to be always one step ahead. The community, meanwhile, developed its own narrative. Locals whispered about a ghost of the parkway, a presence that watched from the woods, invisible but ever-present. Teenagers dared each other to drive at night along the road, some claiming to hear strange sounds or see headlights vanish around bends. Parents warned their children to avoid the area after dark. Even decades later, the sense of unease persists, a reminder that the murders left a mark on the landscape itself, a scar on the region's collective memory. Books, documentaries, and true crime podcasts later dissected the case, exploring every suspect, every theory, and every missed opportunity. Analysts debated whether the killer had died, moved away, or simply blended into the community, unseen and unreported. Some suggested he was someone entirely ordinary by day, someone whose neighbors never suspected a thing. Others feared he might still be alive, watching the parkway from afar, a shadow in plain sight. The Colonial Parkway murders remain unsolved to this day. Families continue to hope for closure, investigators still hold on to pieces of evidence, and the road itself carries an air of quiet dread. Each turn, each secluded pull-off, is a reminder of what happened there and of the person, or people, responsible who slipped through every net law enforcement tried to set. For those who lived through it, and those who study it now, the fear is enduring. The case is not just about what was done, but about the meticulous, patient, and methodical way it was carried out. It's a stark illustration that evil can be deliberate, calculated, and sometimes impossible to catch. And for the young couples who once drove that road in peace, the parkway will always be a place where trust met terror in the most horrifying way imaginable. Decades have passed since the first murders along the Colonial Parkway, but the road has never been the same. What was once a scenic drive through Virginia's historic countryside became a symbol of fear, a place where families and couples once felt safe but now whispered warnings to one another. The murders left more than bodies behind, they left a shadow, a lingering unease that no patrol or investigative breakthrough could erase. Law enforcement never solved the case. Despite modern forensic advances, DNA retesting, and decades of analysis, the killer, or killers, remained beyond reach. Suspects were questioned, leads were followed, and criminal profilers built detailed psychological profiles, but nothing resulted in arrests. The methodical, patient execution of the attack suggested someone capable of slipping in and out of society unnoticed, someone who could plan and strike without leaving a trace. It was a level of cunning that left even experienced detectives baffled. For families, the lack of answers was devastating. Parents who lost children on the parkway never received closure. Siblings and friends were left with haunting questions: why them? Could it have been prevented? And, most chillingly, was the person responsible still out there, blending in among neighbors, co-workers, and strangers, unseen yet ever present? The community itself changed. Couples stopped taking late-night drives along the parkway. Locals learned to be hyper-aware of their surroundings, and every quiet pull-off, every hidden curve, was viewed with suspicion. Teenagers dared each other to visit the scene of the murders, often claiming to see ghostly lights or shadows. Some avoided the parkway entirely. The road, once a symbol of scenic romance and history, had been transformed into a landscape of caution and whispered fear. True crime enthusiasts and researchers continue to study the case, dissecting timelines, revisiting old evidence, and analyzing the psychological profile of the killer. Theories abound. Some believe the killer died without confessing, others think they moved away, and a few fear he may still be alive, watching the road and waiting for opportunity. Every twist in the case, every unanswered question, serves as a reminder of how patient and calculating a killer can be, and how elusive justice sometimes becomes. The Colonial Parkway murders endure in the American imagination as one of the most haunting unsolved cases. It is a story not just of violence, but of control, patience, and meticulous planning. The murders serve as a chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight and that some predators are careful, methodical, and disturbingly familiar. Even today, if you drive the Colonial Parkway at night, the scenic rivers, dense forests, and winding curves are beautiful, but they carry the memory of what happened there. The road's history is written in whispers: young couples who vanished, a killer who disappeared, and a community forever changed. The parkway is quiet now, but the fear, the questions, and the lingering presence of what once terrorized the road remain. And that is what makes the Colonial Parkway murders not just a story of crime, but a story of horror, patience, and enduring mystery, a story that refuses to be forgotten. In 1976, Circleville, Ohio, looked like the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. Small town, quiet streets, everybody knew everybody. But then something started creeping into the lives of the people there. Letters. Dozens of them. They were handwritten in uneven block capital letters, with no signature, no clue who sent them. Each envelope was postmarked from Columbus, 30 miles away. And these weren't friendly notes. The writer seemed to know people's secrets. Affairs, lies, even crimes that no one else should have known about. Whoever it was, they wanted to expose Circleville's dirty laundry. One woman quickly became the main target, Mary Gillespie. She was a school bus driver, a mother, and well-liked in the community. Her first letter accused her of having an affair with the local school superintendent, Gordon Massey. The writer demanded she end it immediately or face dire consequences. Mary kept the letter hidden, thinking maybe it was just a mean-spirited prank. But more letters followed, each more aggressive than the last. Soon her husband Ron started getting them too. The writer threatened to harm their children if Mary didn't stop the supposed affair. The Gillespies tried to carry on with their lives, but the letters just kept coming. Hundreds of them poured into Circleville over the years, hitting not just Mary, but dozens of townspeople. Each one in that same blocky handwriting. Each one exposing secrets that many believed no outsider could possibly know. By the summer of 1977, things escalated. Ron received a call one night, believed to be from the letter writer. Furious, he grabbed his gun, stormed out of the house, and got into his truck. Not long after, his vehicle was found crashed into a tree. Ron was dead. His gun had been fired once, though no bullet was ever found. Investigators couldn't determine if it was an accident or something more sinister. To this day, how Ron died remains one of the biggest mysteries in the sea. After Ron's death, the letters kept coming, and Mary's nightmare got worse. In 1983, while driving her bus route, she noticed something odd along the road, a sign with yet another threatening message about her. As she pulled it down, she realized it was booby-trapped. Behind the sign was a crude homemade gun rigged to fire at whoever tried to remove it. Mary narrowly escaped being killed. Police traced the gun and eventually arrested a man named Paul Freshour, Mary's former brother-in-law. Paul and his wife had gone through a bitter divorce, and many suspected he might have been behind the letters. Investigators said the gun used in the booby trap belonged to him. In 1984, Paul was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But here's where things get strange. After Paul was locked up, the letters didn't stop. They kept arriving in Circleville, still in the same blocky handwriting. Paul even received one himself in prison, taunting him. He swore he had nothing to do with them. And even after his release in the 1990s, the letters continued for a while before finally stopping. The case remains unsolved. Some believe Paul was guilty, others think he was framed, and a few insist there was more than one letter writer. Whoever it was, they managed to terrorize an entire town for nearly 2 decades without ever being caught. To this day, no one knows who the Circleville letter writer really was. The letters became more threatening. They were relentless, hammering away at Mary Gillespie's reputation, her marriage, even her children. What terrified her most wasn't just the accusations, it was the level of detail. The writer knew what roads she drove on her bus route, which houses she stopped at, even the errands she ran on weekends. Whoever it was, this wasn't some distant crank with a grudge. This was someone close, someone in Circleville, watching. By the summer of 1977, Mary and her husband Ron had been dealing with these anonymous notes for over a year. Then came August. One evening, Ron received a phone call at home. Family members later recalled the conversation was short, but whatever was said on the other end infuriated him. Many believe it was the letter writer taunting him directly. Ron slammed down the phone, grabbed his pistol, and stormed out of the house. Moments later, just down the road, Ron's pickup truck veered off and smashed into a tree. He was killed instantly. Investigators at first treated it like a tragic accident. The official report claimed Ron had been drinking heavily, though his family insisted he wasn't a heavy drinker. And then there was the detail no one could explain: the gun he carried had been fired once. A shot had been taken. But no bullet was recovered, no explanation offered. Had Ron pulled the trigger himself? Did someone fire at him? Or, as some theorize, had the letter writer orchestrated a trap to lure him out of the house and silence him? His death only deepened the mystery, because soon after, the letters returned, nastier than before. The town of Circleville began to feel hunted. No one knew who they could trust. Dozens of people received letters, accusing them of theft, adultery, corruption. Some were told to leave town, others were warned their secrets would be exposed. The writer wasn't just targeting Mary anymore, the entire community was under siege. For Mary, things became unbearable. In 1983, she was driving her bus route when she noticed a crude sign posted along the roadside. Once again, it mentioned her by name, mocking and threatening her. Furious, Mary pulled the sign down. But as she did, she saw something chilling behind it, a box rigged with a gun. Someone had built a booby trap designed to fire at whoever tried to remove the sign. The only reason Mary wasn't killed is because the mechanism jammed. When police examined the weapon, they traced it back to a man named Paul Freshour. Paul wasn't a stranger, he was Mary's former brother-in-law, and his marriage had collapsed bitterly a few years earlier. Investigators decided they had their culprit. In 1984, Paul was put on trial for attempted murder. Despite little physical evidence tying him directly to the trap, besides claims the gun had once been his, the jury convicted him. Paul was sentenced to 10 years in prison. For a while, it seemed the nightmare was over. But then, something bizarre happened. The letters didn't stop. They kept coming, in the same style, with the same blocky handwriting. They even showed up while Paul was behind bars. One was even sent to Paul himself inside prison, mocking him. He swore to anyone who would listen that he wasn't the writer, and that someone was framing him. The contradictions piled up. If Paul really was the Circleville letter writer, how could the letters continue while he was incarcerated? If he wasn't the writer, then why did the booby-trapped gun trace back to him? Some investigators quietly wondered if more than one person had been involved, or if Paul had simply been an easy scapegoat. After nearly a decade, Paul was paroled in the mid-1990s. But even then, the letters trickled on for a time before finally stopping. By then, the damage was done. Circleville had been living in paranoia for almost 2 decades. Relationships had collapsed, reputations destroyed, and in the case of Ron Gillespie, a man had lost his life under mysterious circumstances. To this day, no one knows who the Circleville letter writer really was. Handwriting experts, investigators, and journalists have all tried to solve it, but the case remains unsolved. Some believe it was Paul. Others insist he was framed, possibly by multiple conspirators who wanted Mary ruined. A few even suggest the truth lies buried in the tangled family feuds and grudges of that small Ohio town. What makes the story so chilling isn't just the unsolved crime. It's the intimacy. The letters were written by someone who knew their victims better than anyone should. They weren't random threats, they were personal, invasive, and relentless. Whoever the Circleville letter writer was, they managed to terrorize an entire community without ever being caught. And that final, lingering question still haunts Circleville: was the real author living quietly among them all along? Even after Ron's sudden death, the letters didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied. Dozens of townspeople began receiving them. Teachers, shopkeepers, even elected officials opened their mailboxes to find the same blocky handwriting, the same cruel accusations. It was as if the entire town was being stalked by an invisible hand. And then, the threats became even more public. Handwritten signs started popping up along Mary Gillespie's school bus route. Some were nailed to telephone poles, others staked into the ground. Each one accused Mary of unspeakable things, affairs, lies, even crimes. They weren't just meant for her anymore. They were placed where anyone could see them: her passengers, her neighbors, the children she drove every day. For Mary, this was the breaking point. In February 1983, she was driving her regular route when she spotted one of the signs. But this time, it wasn't just about her. It mentioned her daughter by name. Furious, she stopped the bus, walked up to the sign, and tried to rip it down. That's when she noticed something strange. The cardboard was attached to a small box, hidden behind the post. Inside was a .25 caliber handgun, rigged to fire the moment the sign was yanked. Someone had built a booby trap, and Mary had almost set it off. Police rushed to investigate. The gun was traced back to one man, Paul Freshour. He was Mary's former brother-in-law. Paul had been married to Mary's sister, but their marriage had ended bitterly. To investigators, this looked like more than coincidence. Paul insisted he had nothing to do with it. He admitted the gun had once been his but claimed it had been stolen from his garage. He also swore he had never written a single letter. Still, authorities were convinced. In 1984, Paul Freshour was put on trial for attempted murder. The prosecution had no handwriting proof. They didn't have fingerprints on the letters. What they did have was the booby trap and the fact that the weapon tied back to him. That was enough. The jury found him guilty, and Paul was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. The people of Circleville breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, after nearly a decade of terror, it seemed like the nightmare was over. But it wasn't. Even while Paul sat in prison, the letters continued. They arrived in the same blocky handwriting, mailed from the same area, taunting not just townspeople, but Paul himself. One even made its way into the prison, addressed directly to him. In it, the writer mocked his conviction, saying justice had been served on the wrong man. This made the case even stranger. If Paul was behind bars, how could the letters keep coming? Some officials dismissed them as hoaxes or claimed Paul had somehow smuggled them out. But handwriting experts argued the new letters were consistent with the originals. Paul never wavered. Until his death in 2012, he maintained his innocence, claiming he had been framed, possibly by someone who knew about his failed marriage and wanted revenge. The letters finally stopped in the mid-1990s, but the damage was done. Over nearly 2 decades, the Circleville writer had destroyed reputations, ended marriages, and possibly caused a man's death. And despite all the investigations, no one has ever been able to prove who was truly behind it all. To this day, Circleville remains haunted by one question: was Paul Freshour the mastermind, or was the real writer someone else, still hiding in plain? Paul Freshour's conviction should have ended everything. The town expected that once he was locked away, the letters would stop. No more accusations, no more secrets spilled into mailboxes, no more fear every time a resident opened their door to find another white envelope. But within weeks of his imprisonment, that expectation was shattered. Letters continued to arrive. They were just as venomous as before, written in the same jagged block handwriting that everyone in Circleville had come to dread. They accused residents of new scandals, called out officials for incompetence, and even mocked the police for putting away the wrong man. The strangest part was the postmarks. Some of the envelopes were stamped from Columbus, as before. Others came from towns farther away, even hundreds of miles beyond Ohio. For Paul, sitting inside his cell in a controlled environment, this should have been impossible. Prison officials inspected his mail, his visitors, his belongings. They insisted he could not be sending anything out. And yet the letters kept coming, consistent in tone and style, as if the same hand was guiding the pen. The townspeople were left in disbelief. If Paul wasn't the writer, then who was? Was there an accomplice on the outside, working with him to keep the campaign alive? Or had the authorities arrested the wrong man entirely, leaving the real writer free to continue tormenting Circleville? Even Paul himself received one of the letters while in prison. It was addressed directly to him. The writer mocked him for being behind bars, suggesting justice had been served on the wrong person. This detail chilled many residents. If Paul wasn't the author, then the real writer was brazen enough to taunt him along with everyone else. Investigators tried to analyze the new letters. Handwriting experts studied them against Paul's known writing samples. The results were inconclusive. Some examiners pointed to similarities, while others insisted the style did not. The lack of fingerprints, DNA, or any other physical evidence left the case stagnant. Meanwhile, the town was still living in fear. Teachers, politicians, and business owners continued to find their lives dissected in anonymous notes. Reputations were destroyed. Marriages collapsed. No one knew who they could trust, and paranoia spread through the community. It seemed as though the writer knew everything: who was fighting, who was cheating, who was hiding secrets. Some residents even suspected the culprit might be someone inside law enforcement, with access to details no ordinary person could know. Paul never stopped proclaiming his innocence. In interviews, he explained that the gun used in the booby trap had been stolen from his garage months before it was found on the signpost. He insisted he had never built any device, never written any threatening letter, and that he was nothing more than a scapegoat. He believed that the real writer had cleverly planted evidence to frame him, taking advantage of his bitter divorce from Mary's sister to create a motive that investigators would seize on. For years, Paul sat behind bars, watching the case unfold from a distance. Every time a new letter surfaced, his claims of innocence seemed more plausible. Still, the authorities held their ground. Some argued that he had somehow found a way to keep the letters flowing, smuggling them through accomplices or manipulating the system. Others quietly admitted that maybe they had rushed to judgment, desperate to put an end to the nightmare. The letters finally stopped in the mid-1990s, nearly 2 decades after they first appeared. No one knew why. Had the writer grown tired of the game? Had they died? Or had the looming suspicion finally forced them into silence? Paul was eventually released on parole. For the rest of his life, he maintained that he had been wrongfully convicted. In 2012, he passed away, never wavering from his claim that he was innocent. To this day, the Circleville Letters remain unsolved. Were they the work of a single obsessed writer who managed to torment a community for nearly 20 years, or the product of multiple people with grudges and inside knowledge? Was Paul Freshour a guilty man who found ways to keep writing from prison, or was he the victim of a carefully orchestrated frame job? The truth may never be known. What is certain is that the Circleville writer left behind one of the most chilling and bizarre mysteries in American true crime history. A case where a simple letter could ruin a life, and where the power of words alone held an entire town hostage. Paul Freshour lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion. Even after his release from prison, people in Circleville couldn't decide whether he was a criminal mastermind who had fooled everyone, or just an unlucky man framed by the real letter writer. Paul himself never stopped fighting back. He maintained a personal website where he published every detail he could about the case, pleading for someone to look deeper. His message was always the same: I didn't do this. But the damage had already been done. His marriage collapsed. His reputation was destroyed. And in Circleville, the whispers never went away. Every time a new letter arrived, residents couldn't help but glance at Paul's name, even if he was hundreds of miles away at the time. That's what makes this case so unsettling. On paper, the conviction made sense: the gun was his. The trap was real. He had ties to Mary. But reality was far messier. The letters after his imprisonment threw the entire theory into chaos. And the more people dug, the stranger it got. Some handwriting experts said the letters matched Paul's writing. Others disagreed, pointing out inconsistencies. To this day, the forensic evidence remains hotly debated. What we're left with is a trail of possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. One theory suggests the letter writer was actually several people, maybe a group of residents with grudges against Mary and others in town. That would explain the writer's encyclopedic knowledge of so many personal details. It wasn't one set of eyes watching Circleville. It was many. Another possibility is even darker: that the real writer intentionally framed Paul, planting his gun at the booby trap to send investigators straight to him. If that's true, then not only was this person cunning enough to avoid being caught for nearly 2 decades, but they were bold enough to taunt the police while doing it. And then there's the chilling chance that the true author might have been someone nobody ever suspected at all. Maybe someone close to the investigation. Maybe someone whose name never appeared in the newspapers. The scariest part: whoever it was, they thrived on control. The letters weren't just threats, they were psychological warfare. They exposed affairs, stirred up jealousy, turned neighbors against each other, and shattered families. And the writer did it all without ever firing a bullet. Just pen and paper. Even now, decades later, Circleville hasn't healed completely. For long-time residents, the memory of those letters still lingers. Imagine living in a town where any secret could be dragged out and nailed to a telephone pole. Imagine knowing that someone nearby was watching, listening, waiting. The Circleville letters are a reminder of something profoundly unsettling. Sometimes, the most dangerous predator doesn't come after you with a weapon. Sometimes, they use your own life, your own secrets, and your own fear as the blade. And the fact that no one has ever been unmasked makes it even worse. Somewhere out there, whether alive or long gone, the Circleville letter writer knows the truth. They know what they did. And they got away with it.
That was another real bedtime story from Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.